They said he walked out of the trees at dawn, when the fog still clung to the ground like something alive. They said his mouth opened as if to speak, and nothing ever came out again. They said whatever happened in those mountains did not want to be named. Before we continue, please subscribe to our channel and tell in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it. On the morning of November 18, 1902, the town of Bartlett, New Hampshire, woke to a rumor that moved faster than church bells. A man had returned from the White Mountains. Not rescued, not carried, returned. He came alone, walking stiffly down the old logging road that cut through the spruce and fir, his boots worn thin, his coat torn at the seams. His name was Thomas Wickham, 34 years old, son of a mill worker, husband to a woman who had already begun to mourn him. For 11 days he had been missing. For 11 days search parties had combed ravines, followed frozen streams, and shouted names into indifferent rock faces. 3 men had entered those mountains together. Only one came back. Thomas was first seen by a farmer named Eli Marsh, who later told the county recorder that he thought he was looking at a ghost. Thomas's face was hollowed, beard grown wild, eyes set deep and unfocused, as though he were still staring into some far-off place no one else could see. He carried a hunting rifle clean and carefully slung over his shoulder. When Marsh asked where the others were, Thomas stopped walking. He turned his head slowly, his lips moved, no sound followed. Marsh would say later that the silence felt wrong, heavier than screaming. By mid-morning, Thomas was seated in the back room of the Bartlett General Store, wrapped in blankets that smelled of wool and kerosene. The town doctor, Edwin Carver, examined him under the dull light of an oil lamp, noting frostbitten fingers, cracked lips, and a series of shallow scratches along his neck and jaw. There was no sign of injury to his throat, no swelling, no bruising. When asked simple questions, Thomas responded with nods, shakes of the head, or by writing clumsy, shaking words on scraps of paper. I cannot speak. I do not know why. The disappearance had begun on November 7th. Thomas, along with his cousin Henry Wickham and a local guide named Samuel Price, set out into the White Mountains to check a line of hunting traps and scout timberland recently purchased by an out-of-state company. It was supposed to be a 3-day trip. Snow came early that year. By the 4th day, when the men had not returned, concern settled in. By the 6th, it hardened into fear. The mountains were unforgiving even to those who knew them well, and yet no one expected this ending. When Thomas was brought home to his wife, Eleanor, she wept openly. She held his face in her hands, searching his eyes for something familiar. He looked at her with recognition, even love, but when she whispered his name, he only swallowed hard and looked away. That was when people began to notice it was not just his voice that was gone. Something else had been taken with it. In the days that followed, Bartlett became a place of quiet tension. Men spoke in low tones at the post office. Women lingered longer after church, exchanging glances instead of words. Thomas was questioned by the sheriff, by a representative from the logging company, by a minister sent from Conway. Each time he answered in writing or gestures. He could recall practical details. Weather, distance, campsites, but whenever the questions turned toward Henry or Samuel toward the final night, his hand froze, the pencil trembled, he would push the paper away. Dr. Carver noted in his journal that Thomas slept poorly. He woke before dawn, eyes wide, breathing shallow, his body rigid as if listening for something approaching. He refused to go near the tree line. When asked why, he wrote only one word: listening. There were no physical explanations that satisfied anyone. His vocal cords appeared intact. His lungs were strong enough, he could cough, he could clear his throat, but when he tried to speak, nothing emerged. The minister suggested shock, the kind that steals speech from soldiers and disaster survivors. The doctor agreed publicly, but privately wrote that he had seen men broken by war who still managed whispers. This was different. Search teams went back into the mountains. They found Henry Wickham's body 3 miles north of the last known campsite, partially buried by snow, face frozen in an expression no one wanted to describe in detail. Samuel Price was never found. No signs of struggle, no animal tracks consistent with an attack, no clear cause of death beyond exposure, though even that felt insufficient. Henry's hands were raw, fingers torn and bleeding, as if he had clawed at stone or ice until there was nothing left to give. Thomas attended the burial, standing apart, hat pulled low. When the minister spoke of God's will, Thomas flinched. When dirt struck the coffin lid, he turned away entirely. people began to notice other things. Thomas no longer laughed. He startled at sudden sounds. He avoided mirrors. Once, when a child shouted behind him in the street, Thomas dropped to his knees, covering his head as if expecting a blow from above. It took several men to calm him. He never returned to the mountains. He never hunted again. And though he lived for many years after, working quiet jobs, moving often, one fact never changed. He never spoke another word, and in a town built on records, testimony, and memory, his silence became the most disturbing thing anyone had ever tried to understand. In the weeks after Thomas Wickham's return, Bartlett settled into an uneasy routine that revolved around him without ever naming it. He became a fixed point of attention, a man everyone watched while pretending not to. Each morning he walked the same stretch of road near his home, never venturing far, never looking toward the dark rise of the white mountains beyond the trees. His posture was careful, as though the world itself might lunge if he moved too quickly. People greeted him softly. He nodded. He wrote brief replies when necessary. The sound of his silence followed him like a second shadow. Sheriff Alden Moore reopened the official inquiry despite pressure from the county to let the matter rest. Missing men were not unusual in those mountains, but a survivor who returned voiceless unsettled even seasoned officials. Moore visited Thomas repeatedly, sitting at the small kitchen table while Eleanor poured coffee that went untouched. The sheriff asked questions slowly, allowing long pauses, hoping something might loosen. Thomas answered what he could. They had made camp near Dry River. The weather turned without warning. Samuel suggested pressing higher to find shelter. Henry argued they should turn back. That was the last clear memory Thomas would commit to paper. When Moore asked what happened after nightfall, Thomas's hand cramped so badly he dropped the pencil. His breathing became shallow, his face draining of color. Eleanor begged the sheriff to stop. Moore did, but he left convinced that whatever silence bound Thomas was not simple trauma. It behaved like a rule, rigid and enforced. The doctor began keeping Thomas under quiet observation. There were moments, Carver wrote, when Thomas seemed on the verge of speech. His lips parted, his throat flexed. Then something stopped him, an internal hesitation that looked less like fear and more like restraint. When encouraged to hum, Thomas shook his head violently. When asked to sing, he backed away as if threatened. Sound itself appeared forbidden. Eleanor noticed it at night. Thomas slept in brief, broken intervals. Sometimes he sat upright in bed, eyes open, staring into the dark. She asked what he saw. He wrote nothing, but his hand shook as he did it. Once near dawn, she heard a noise escape him. Not a word, not even a breath, but a thin, broken sound that ended abruptly. Thomas clamped his mouth shut and pressed his hands to his throat, eyes wide with something close to panic. Outside the house, rumors grew. Some said Thomas had frozen his vocal cords beyond repair. Others whispered about mountain madness, the kind that hollowed men out and left something else behind. An old logger claimed there were places in the Whites where sound did not behave correctly, where voices carried to things that should not hear them. Those stories were usually laughed off. After Thomas, they were told more carefully. Henry Wickham's death troubled investigators more as time passed. His hands showed damage inconsistent with simple exposure, fingernails torn away. Skin abraded as if scraped repeatedly against rock. The coroner noted muscle tension, suggesting prolonged exertion before death. It looked less like a man succumbing to cold and more like a man trying desperately to reach somewhere he could not see. Samuel Price remained missing. His family held out hope longer than most. A guide knew the mountains better than anyone, yet spring thaw revealed nothing. No bones, no gear, no trace that could be recorded. It was as if Samuel had stepped out of the landscape entirely. Thomas was asked once carefully whether Samuel was alive when he last saw him. Thomas stared at the question written on paper for a long time. Then he wrote, "I do not know if alive is the right word." He refused to elaborate. By early December, Thomas left Bartlett without announcement. Eleanor said he needed distance. They moved south and west, following work wherever it appeared. Each town repeated the pattern. Quiet man, polite, unsettling stillness. He never stayed long. Employers noted his reliability, but also his refusal to work after dark or near dense woods. He slept with lamps lit. He barred doors meticulously. Years later, a letter reached Dr. Carver, postmarked from Vermont. Inside was a single sheet in Thomas's careful hand. It read, "I still hear it. It does not follow, but it waits where it always was. Silence is the only thing it cannot cross, Carver never replied. He filed the letter among his papers, uncertain whether it was a confession, a warning, or simply the last piece of a story that refused to finish. By the time the decade turned, Thomas Wickham had become a footnote in local memory, a name spoken only when someone wanted to remind another that the mountains did not forgive curiosity. Bartlett moved on as towns always do. New families arrived, old houses collapsed under snow. Yet the White Mountains remained unchanged, watching with the same patient indifference that had swallowed 3 men and returned only one altered. What did not fade was the pattern Thomas left behind. Wherever he settled, the same disturbances appeared, subtle enough to be dismissed, persistent enough to unsettle. In a mill town outside Montpelier, a night watchman swore he heard voices echoing along the river after midnight, though the mills had long been silent. In rural New York, a farmer claimed his livestock grew agitated whenever fog rolled down from the hills, lowing and stamping as if sensing something approaching. In each place Thomas lived nearby, quiet, withdrawn, always gone within months. Eleanor aged quickly. The strain of living beside a man whose silence carried weight wore her thin. She loved him, but she could not reach him. At night she sometimes spoke aloud, hoping the sound of her voice might anchor him. Thomas listened intently, eyes fixed on her lips, as if memorizing the shapes words made so he could avoid them. When she cried, he held her with fierce urgency, as though afraid her grief might turn audible in the wrong way. In 1911, Eleanor died of pneumonia after a harsh winter. Thomas buried her himself, refusing help from neighbors. At the graveside, he stood unmoving long after the others left. Those who watched from a distance swore they saw his mouth open, his chest rise, as if he meant to speak her name. Nothing came. He pressed his forehead to the frozen earth instead, shoulders shaking in silence. After her death, Thomas vanished more completely. Records place him briefly in Pennsylvania, then Ohio, then nothing certain. His trail thinned to rumors and half-documented sightings, a mute laborer who paid in cash. A man who flinched at church bells, a tenant who boarded windows not against light but sound. In one instance, a boarding house owner recalled Thomas destroying a phonograph with sudden violence, smashing the horn and mechanism beyond repair before retreating to his room and refusing to emerge for days. The mountains, meanwhile, continued their work. In 1914, 2 college students went missing near the Dry River Wilderness while mapping trails. Search parties found one body weeks later, face frozen in an expression of intense concentration rather than fear. His companion was never found. The official explanation cited exposure and inexperience. Privately, some of the older guides noticed the similarities piling up like stones: missing time, fragmented camps. Survivors who could not explain what they had heard. A journal surfaced in 1919 among the effects of a deceased hermit found near the New Hampshire border. The man had lived alone for years, subsisting on trapping and barter. His writings were disjointed, obsessive. One passage stood out. It described a sound that was not a voice but behaved like one, shaping itself around the listener's memories, pulling at thoughts like hands testing a lock. The hermit wrote that speaking aloud made it stronger, clearer. Silence starved it. He concluded with a warning scrawled so deeply it tore the page: "Do not answer it." The journal was dismissed as madness. It was archived, then forgotten. Thomas Wickham reappeared only once more in any verifiable way. In 1923, a census taker in rural Michigan noted a lodger who communicated entirely through writing. Age estimated mid-50s. Occupation listed as laborer. Under remarks, the taker added, avoids woods, sleeps with cotton in ears, pays extra for rooms far from roads. The signature matched Thomas's earlier handwriting almost exactly. Not long after, a fire destroyed the boarding house. Thomas survived, others did not. Witnesses said he emerged from the smoke coughing violently, clutching his throat, eyes wild. Some claimed they heard a sound then, thin and raw, torn free by the heat and chaos. If they did, no one could agree what it was. After that, Thomas disappeared for good. Decades later, as hiking surged in popularity and the White Mountains filled with new footsteps, search and rescue reports quietly accumulated familiar phrases. Disorientation without cause. Sudden, overwhelming urge to remain silent. Campers found with hands pressed over mouths, eyes fixed on nothing. Most were brought back alive, a few were not. Modern explanations lean toward psychological stress, hypothermia, environmental factors that distort perception. These accounts satisfy paperwork. They do not explain the consistency of the fear, or why those who return often avoid speaking of what they experienced, even when physically unharmed. Dr. Carver's papers were rediscovered in the 1950s, donated to a small historical society. Among them was Thomas Wickham's final letter. It was displayed briefly, then removed after visitors complained of unease. One volunteer noted that reading it aloud made her lightheaded. She never tried again. The letter ends with a line Carver underlined in pencil, perhaps without knowing why. It reads, "Silence is not absence. It is a boundary. Those who study the case now do so carefully." They read quietly, they hike with respect. They understand that some histories do not want witnesses, only listeners who know when not to respond. After the Michigan fire, Thomas Wickham passed beyond public record, yet the silence surrounding him did not behave like an ending. It spread outward, attaching itself to places and people who had never known his name. The years that followed produced a strange, thin trail of corroboration, unconnected reports, archived letters, oral histories whispered rather than written. Each piece alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a shape that refused to be ignored. In 1927, a forestry survey near the Pemigewasset Wilderness recorded an anomaly. Rangers mapping sound patterns for avalanche studies noted zones where echoes behaved irregularly, absorbed rather than reflected. One margin note, later crossed out, suggested unnatural dampening. The survey was filed away, funding shifted, no further inquiry followed. But guides who worked those slopes said the same thing in their own words. Voices died there. Shouted warnings fell flat as if swallowed before reaching another ear. Old men remembered earlier. Before Thomas, before 1902, a French-Canadian trapper's tale from the 1870s spoke of a presence that learned its way into men by listening. Abenaki elders warned that some valleys were not empty but waiting. That sound was an invitation as much as a tool. These accounts were labeled folklore, incompatible with modern sensibilities. Yet they shared a detail no one could quite explain, the insistence that survival depended not on strength but restraint. The Wickham case became a quiet reference point for a handful of researchers who specialized in lost person phenomena. Not the sensationalists, but archivists who read coroners, reports, and weather logs line by line. They noticed that survivors often exhibited the same behavior Thomas had shown decades earlier. A refusal to speak immediately after rescue, written communication preferred over verbal. A tendency to press fingers against the throat during moments of stress, as if checking that something remained contained. One psychologist, Dr. Miriam Klein, interviewed 7 such survivors in the 1940s. Her notes, never formally published, suggest a shared sensation described differently by each subject: pressure behind the ears. A feeling of being addressed without words, an urge to answer, paired with a certainty that doing so would be catastrophic. Klein concluded that the phenomenon functioned like a predator adapted not to flesh but attention. It did not chase, it waited. Thomas Wickham's silence in this context reads less like trauma and more like strategy, a boundary learned under duress and maintained at great personal cost. He lost his wife, his place, his voice, but he lived. The others did not. Whatever followed them into the White Mountains appeared unable or unwilling to cross that boundary. In the late 1960s, hikers near Mount Carrigain reported hearing a single rifle shot echoing through the trees, though no one was found. The sound carried oddly, flattening distance. Rescue teams searched for days without success. Eventually, the report was amended. The sound could not be confirmed. No shell casings were recovered. The incident faded except among those who knew the old story. Some remembered that Thomas Wickham had carried a rifle too, unloaded, unused. Modern explanations remain cautious. Acoustics, psychology, environmental stressors. The language of science circles the edges, careful not to assign intent where none can be measured, and yet intent lingers in the margins. In the choices people make after they return, the vows of silence, the avoidance of certain places. The way some survivors wake at night with the certainty that something is listening for them to speak. A final note appears in a 1974 hiking guide, revised after multiple complaints. A single sentence added under safety recommendations: avoid shouting unnecessarily. Sound carries unpredictably in these mountains. The phrasing is practical, the implication is not. Thomas Wickham is buried in an unmarked grave, location uncertain. His name appears briefly in county records, then disappears. No headstone warns visitors, no plaque explains what he endured. Perhaps that is appropriate. Warnings, after all, require words. What remains is the pattern. 3 men entered the mountains. 1 returned, carrying knowledge he could not share. The silence he kept may have been the only thing that kept him human, or alive, or both. The distinction matters less than the lesson embedded in the story's persistence. There are places where listening is dangerous, where the safest response is none at all. The White Mountains still stand unchanged, patient. They do not call out, they do not need to. They wait for someone else to make the first sound. By the time Thomas Wickham's name resurfaced again, it did so indirectly, embedded in the margins of other lives. Silence, once learned, does not remain contained. It migrates, it alters patterns. In the decades after his disappearance from public life, the White Mountains accumulated a quiet ledger of similar absences. Men and women who returned from short excursions changed in ways too subtle for headlines but too consistent to ignore. Speech slowed, stories shortened. Some abandoned language altogether when pressed about what they had seen or heard. Communities adjusted around them, learning not to ask certain questions. In 1919, a schoolteacher named Edwin Marsh resigned abruptly from his post in Littleton after a winter outing gone wrong. He had been missing for 2 nights during a blizzard, found alive beneath a lean-to of pine boughs with no frostbite and no memory he was willing to share. His resignation letter was brief and carefully worded. He cited a loss of confidence in his own voice. Within a year, he had taken a job cataloging minerals, work that required precision but no conversation. Those who knew him noticed he flinched at church hymns, lips moving without sound. Newspapers occasionally documented such cases, always stripping them of context. Exposure, shock, exhaustion, the accepted vocabulary of survival left no room for implication. Yet among rangers and guides, an informal etiquette emerged. When someone came back altered, they were left alone. No celebratory retellings, no demands for heroism. Silence was treated as a wound that could reopen if handled carelessly. Archival weather reports reveal something else. A pattern of sound-related anomalies clustered around incidents of disappearance. Sudden stillness during storms, wind that moved foliage without producing noise. Accounts of snowfall arriving without the usual hiss. Scientists dismissed these as perception errors under stress, but perception, repeated often enough, becomes data of a different kind. The mountains, it seemed, were capable of withholding sound as easily as reflecting it. In 1933, during the construction of a fire tower near Mount Hancock, workers reported hearing voices calling from the ravine below. Names were spoken accurately, sometimes in the voice of a loved one. The calls ceased whenever the men descended to investigate. One worker, a recent immigrant from Poland, followed the sound alone. He returned at dusk with torn clothing and bloodied hands, unable to speak. He lived another 40 years, never uttering a word again, communicating only through notes written with meticulous care. When asked once why he remained silent, he wrote a single sentence: "It hears answers." These fragments never coalesced into a formal theory. They existed in footnotes, in campfire warnings passed between those who worked the land long enough to recognize its habits. The old belief resurfaced quietly. That something in the wilderness did not hunt bodies but responses. That it learned by listening, growing more precise with every echo it consumed. Speech in that context was not expression but exposure. Thomas Wickham's behavior aligned perfectly with this unspoken understanding. He avoided crowded places not from fear of people but from fear of sound. He selected work that kept him isolated. He communicated with restraint. His silence was not emptiness but vigilance. Those who crossed paths with him later recalled the intensity of his listening, the way he seemed to weigh every noise before allowing it space. There is a letter preserved in a private collection, dated 1908, unsigned, addressed to a ranger stationed near Franconia Notch. It warns against shouting during rescues, against calling names into ravines, against answering voices heard where no person could reasonably be. The handwriting matches Thomas Wickham's known script, though no signature confirms it. The ranger filed the letter away. Protocol did not change, tradition did. By mid-century, improvements in equipment and communication reduced disappearances but did not eliminate them. Radios failed inexplicably in certain zones, voices distorted, signals dropped without cause. Search parties learned to rely on visual markers instead: flags, smoke, light, anything but sound. The silence Thomas carried was not unique, only early. He was among the first to survive long enough to understand the terms of survival. Others followed without knowing why. They simply felt it. The instinct to withhold, to resist the urge to call out into the dark. Even now, hikers report moments when the forest seems to lean closer, attentive. When every snapped twig feels amplified, yet no echo returns, most dismiss the sensation and keep moving. A few turn back, fewer still remember the old stories. Of the man who came back alive and never spoke again, of the lesson embedded in his absence, that some truths are not meant to be voiced, and some silences are not emptiness at all, but warning. Decades after Thomas Wickham vanished into the snow and returned a ghost of his former self, the mountains themselves seemed to carry his silence like a living organism. By the 1950s, residents of the White Mountains spoke of a peculiar hush that settled unpredictably across the valleys and ridges. Birds would stop their calls mid-song. Streams would move without murmur. Even the wind seemed to hesitate among the pines, bending but not sighing. Those who had known Thomas, or others like him, swore that the mountains remembered, and that the act of remembering demanded quiet. One such account comes from Eleanor Whitcomb, a forest ranger stationed near the Pemigewasset River in 1954. She wrote of a hiker who emerged from the dense woods without words, carrying a small bundle of clothes. He appeared healthy, alert, but utterly incapable of speech. Eleanor attempted to communicate, asking simple questions, gesturing to landmarks, pointing toward roads, but he only followed her silently, stepping with deliberate care, eyes scanning every movement as if aware of an invisible auditor. When she offered food, he accepted, yet no sound escaped his lips. When pressed by other rangers, Eleanor simply shook her head and said, "Some lessons the mountains teach in whispers." Not shouts. Researchers later unearthed journals that described Thomas's own later years in isolation. He had taken residence in a small cabin perched precariously on the side of a ridge, where he lived with only animals and firelight for company. Notes indicated he cataloged the behavior of the forest, marking subtle cues: the absence of sound after a snowfall, the way fog muffled footsteps differently than frost, the minute variations in the river's hiss during different seasons. He wrote of the voices he sometimes thought he heard, vague echoes of those who had vanished before him, repeating in the empty air, never clear, always distorted. He did not attempt to answer. He did not call back. Local folklore began to fold his silence into broader myths. Children whispered about the man who returned from the mountains but had lost the ability to speak, who could hear everything yet reveal nothing. The story served as caution: do not call into the woods, do not insist upon understanding, and above all, respect the hush. For the mountains did not only conceal bodies, they concealed truths. To disturb them with sound was to invite peril, subtle but relentless. Archival letters hint at Thomas's awareness of the effect his return had on the townspeople. In one fragment, he described observing families from a distance, watching their conversations, noting their tonal shifts. He noted how often they asked him questions, expecting normal replies. Yet when he refused to speak, a profound discomfort settled over them. They do not know what it is like, he wrote, to hear everything without the chance to respond. They think silence is absence, but it is presence, a mirror of what they cannot bear to acknowledge. His handwriting wavered in the margins, as though even the pen could not entirely contain the weight of what he experienced. The 1960s brought more reports of silent returnees, individuals who disappeared for hours, days, even weeks, and re-emerged with intact bodies but fractured vocal faculties. While some cases were dismissed as trauma-induced muteness, others contained the same eerie hallmarks Thomas had exhibited: acute listening, a measured movement through landscapes, and an instinctive avoidance of human interaction whenever possible. Observers noted that these individuals sometimes led animals through the forest with uncanny precision, as if the creatures themselves understood the unspoken rules of survival. This pattern mirrored Thomas's later life, further cementing the idea that his silence had been a deliberate adaptation rather than a mere consequence of trauma. In letters exchanged among forest wardens, one phrase recurred with quiet reverence: "The voice is a risk." It was shorthand for the understanding that sound in these particular environments, dense, reverent, and alive, invited consequences beyond the observable. In some cases, animals reacted violently to human noise. In others, people reported chills or inexplicable disorientation. Those familiar with Thomas's story believed these were remnants of his influence, that his survival had revealed an invisible boundary between the natural and the unnatural, and that this boundary could only be navigated through restraint. Thomas himself never left direct testimony, yet traces of his perspective surfaced in curious ways. He annotated maps marking territories he had crossed and drawing symbols that suggested attention to echo, resonance, and absence. One map, recovered posthumously, detailed a network of caves and gullies with notes like "silent path, wind speaks," and "avoid when alone." The carefulness of his records indicated an acute awareness of forces that eluded ordinary perception. Even among the educated and the trained, these annotations were largely indecipherable, suggesting that some knowledge remained intentionally encoded, a warning to those who would wander heedlessly. By the late 20th century, Thomas Wickham had become a legend in both whispered folklore and academic curiosity. Anthropologists, ecologists, and historians referred to him in varying tones, sometimes as a case study of extreme wilderness adaptation, sometimes as an enigmatic subject of paranormal investigation. The line between human and forest had blurred in his narrative, raising questions that remain unanswered. Did he survive because he abandoned speech, or did he survive because the mountains themselves recognized his submission to silence? The distinction mattered little, both spoke to the same unsettling truth. Some places and some experiences demand absence rather than presence, listening rather than speaking. The final years of Thomas's life were recorded sparsely, but enough to understand his enduring caution. He was found in 1971, alone in his cabin, sitting upright at a table with a notebook open before him, pen still in hand. He had neither eaten nor drunk, and his lips had not moved in decades. The coroner noted no signs of violence, disease, or malnutrition. His body appeared preserved, his mind, or whatever portion of it remained, quiet, attuned to the mountains. Those who retrieved his effects found meticulously written observations, but no explanation for his silence. Perhaps he had learned the ultimate truth, that some horrors, some knowledge, some awareness demanded containment, not through forgetfulness, not through secrecy, but through deliberate quiet. If this tale found you tonight, let it rest with a like, and wake again with a subscribe.